So welcome everybody to the CPR workshop, which is contrast, prosody, and repetition. And those three things are things that you can think about as a songwriter every time you write a song, because this really breaks down what's important to write songs that connect with your listener. So I think we'd all agree that songs connect with us on an emotional level, but they do that through a structural process and a content process. So what I wanted to go over tonight is kind of how you can start thinking about that within your own songwriting. So when we think about songwriting, there's really two components in every song that we write. There's content and there's structure. And content is what we say, and then your structure is really how we say it. So your structure could be thought of as kind of the film score that's underneath of what you are saying within your song. So content and structure. So both content and structure can be guided by thinking about contrast, prosody, and then repetition as well. So those are kind of your high-level tools that you have when you think about the structure of your song. And always be thinking about content and structure in delivering your intended emotion, and make your writing decisions based on how is that delivering that emotion to your listener. So you may, as a writer, have the urge to do something just for the sake of doing it, but is that really sending the message that you want to send to the person that's listening to the song? So that's something very important that sounds easy on the surface, but one of the things to do is you really need to determine what is that intended idea, or what is the emotion that my song is actually delivering. Because a lot of times I think writers think about situations, right? Like they might be writing about falling in love. Well, that's a broad topic. What emotion, or what specific emotion about falling in love are you trying to deliver to the listener? Is it excitement? Is it nervousness? Is it regret? You know, there could be a number of different emotions that you're trying to deliver, and your structural decisions that you make should be geared towards how you want to deliver the emotion. So you have to, as you're writing, ask yourself, every decision that you make, does this strengthen or weaken how my listener experiences or feels what I'm trying to say? So if you're looking at a song and you're like, I really think I need to change this section, or I need to change a line, or I need to change tempo, does that help or hinder what your intended emotion is trying to say? So again, this seems simple, but I think a lot of times as writers, we don't slow down to ask these questions about the decisions that we're making. So the thing to keep in mind is structure matters more than most people think. Think about it as architecture, right? Like if you built a house and you put a toilet on the island in the kitchen, like somebody may not buy that house, right? So if you write songs and you throw in goofy parts just because you want to be creative and try to break rules, nobody may be buying your house, because that doesn't necessarily make sense from a structural standpoint. So something to keep in mind. So let's jump in to repetition first. But before we do that, are there any questions about what we just covered, kind of from what we're trying to accomplish? Cool. So repetition. So this is a powerful tool. And you see, I repeated that. It's a powerful tool. So let's talk about repetition. So repetition, easy, it's repeating parts of a song. And this, again, is a powerful writing tool. I hear a lot of newer writers that almost shy away from repetition because they don't want to be that crappy pop song that they heard on KDWB that repeats the same chorus like 80,000 times. But the idea of this is, and not that pop is crappy because I write pop songs, but the idea is repetition usually isn't being used as much as you think it is, and it really is a tool that you can use to get points across. And we use it in our everyday lives where if we have something important to say, we repeat it. And if we want to remember something, we repeat it. And if we want someone else to remember something, we repeat it. So repetition seems simple, but again, very powerful. So why use repetition in your songs? Well, repetition creates patterns that listeners can remember and they can sing and move along to it. Repetition also creates expectations for your listener that you can either meet or you can play with their expectations as well. And it also emphasizes important ideas. And one thing I didn't put on here, but repetition also gives the listener a sense of familiarity, which is kind of that coming home feeling and feeling like you understand what's going on, and maybe you went away from a part of a song and now you're coming back to repeat it, so that gives them that sense of closure. Camden, you had a question?
Oh my goodness gracious, that's a dumb thing. Okay. um so you talk about repetition. So you talk about choruses. Well, I always, make sure to have a chorus and everything. I usually go by the standard, two verses, two choruses, a bridge, and a chorus at the end. Um, but are you talking? But so, uh, would it be good to have repetition in other ways, or would you suggest there be repetition in other ways than just the chorus, or like how would you incorporate that within the verses and the chorus itself, and everything?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that you can repeat. So Camden, what you're referring to is repeating song sections, but you can go as, small as you can repeat words, you can repeat notes, you can repeat rhythmic patterns, you can repeat chords, you can repeat chord progression. So it goes all the way down to the small level all the way up to repeating song sections, right? So um it's like songs are sort of layers of things that are put together, and repetition and prosody and contrast, which we'll talk about, all can be applied to every level of that. And I think when people talk about crafting songs and when people talk about rewriting songs, you kind of start at the zoomed out level where you're looking at just the sections, but then you zoom in and you start to look at how can I use repetition even in a verse? Like maybe, you'll see songs that the first line in the verse repeats in the last line of the verse, because maybe that's a really strong idea or something that the writer wants the listener to know or hear. And that could also be part of the hook of the song as well. So good question, Camden. So there's two types of repetition. So there's exact repetition, which is repeating something exactly the way that it was. And then there's also varied repetition, which is just like it sounds, where something is changed, but other parts are repeated. So you'll see this a lot within like some rhythmic motifs or melodic motifs where there there may be part of a line that's repeated, but then a note is maybe added, or maybe a note is taken away, or maybe like a segment of it is played over and over again. So you can either repeat something exactly, or you can vary what you're repeating. So decisions on repetition really come down to, should I repeat or should I not repeat? And should I repeat it exactly or should I change it? Repeating part or all. If you repeat just part, that's called segmenting because you're taking a segment of the repetition. You can also extend it, which means you're making something longer, or you can shorten it and use just a shorter part of the thing that you're repeating as well. So this comes into play in lyric lines. It comes into play with melodic lines. It also comes into play with chord progressions. Like an example might be, let's say you have a 1 4 5 6 chord progression. You could repeat it exactly. So it goes again 1 4 5 6. Or maybe you repeat just part of it. So it's 1 4 5 6 1 4. Or, that's also extending it. But what if we shorten it? What if it's just 1 4 5? Right? So you can also think about your grooves, any part of the song really. So lyric, harmony, melody, or the groove as well. Any questions on that piece of it? Perfect. So one of the things we've talked about in other workshops is the rule of two. And again, I know we always say there's no rules, but I just think rule of two sounds kind of easy. And so basically the rule of two comes down to, if you repeat something twice, don't do it again until you do something else. So a good way to remember this is think of AABA. So again, if you repeat something twice, don't do it again until you do something else. So what that looks like in practice, and this is where the AABA comes in, is you do it again, do something else, and then repeat the first thing that you did. And if you're looking for a way to make a catchy melody in a verse or a chorus, this is a great way to add familiarity and some contrast, which we'll talk about, because the B line is actually a contrasting line. So you may have a melody line happen once for your first line of your verse. The melody would be exactly the same, or maybe a little bit of variation. But then the third line would be more variation before you go back to repeating the first line as well. So this is kind of a tool that you can have in your toolbox that can really help as you think about writing not only lyrics, but melody, harmony, and all of that stuff as well. And Camden in the chat to me said, trying to balance between repetition and making sure you aren't boring your listener seems like quite a task. For sure. So that's where the rule of two comes into play, is you don't want, so the reason why you may want to repeat something more than once is because it fits with what you're trying to say, right? So that's when the prosody kicks in, and that will make more sense when we hit prosody too. So again, you can repeat lyrics, which could be repeating words. You could repeat phrases. You could repeat sayings, titles. Melody, you can repeat notes, phrases, and melodic motifs or melodic patterns. Harmony, you can repeat chords, chord progressions. Groove, you could repeat whole sections. You could repeat riffs, rhythmic patterns, and those types of things as well. So repetition can be used in any of those areas. Something becomes musical as it's repeated. So even a drum pattern, or maybe a strumming pattern on a guitar becomes musical based on that repetition as well. Richard.
I was just gonna go actually, to like the drums, because it's like if you just go one time, people are just like, what was that? But if you now, like, there's like a tempo implied, even though it's like very small. I watched an interesting video about that too. But if you get four of those, all of a sudden we're all like locked in. Or if you heard, like, we all know, if you do that one time, well, by now we all know what that means. But like the first time anyone heard that, if you just heard that rhythm and out in the world, you might not necessarily pick up on it. But you hear that 2 times in a row, and then you're ready to listen to Freddie Mercury, and you're ready for the whole song. But I wanted to also real quick comment on when you were talking about the repetition at the smallest scale. Here we're talking about like beats and rhythm and how that scales up throughout the song, and they touched on it in the video there. Like, when you think about it, like your job as the songwriter, your goal is to use repetition so effectively that you get the repetition you really want, which is the listener saying, I need the whole thing again. I need all of those repetitions again. That's the repetition we want to get. And if we effectively use repetition, we can get it.
Correct.
Easier said than done, I suppose. But
yeah, so it's really about, like what you said, you're creating that repetition so it feels familiar and it feels good, but also within that repetition is what we're going to talk about next, which is that contrast, which is the smallest piece of contrast that you can have is like a kick and a snare, right? You have boom, ka, boom, ka. It's tension, release. And that creates movement. And that happens at all levels of your song as well. Hazeline, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's just running in my head. I'm thinking about all of like the motifs and musical hooks in songs, how they always are repetitive. And I even heard someone say that sometimes they put up like 6 riffs or things and musical hooks inside of a song, just in one song. And I'm thinking, usually because I don't use my DAW, I don't know how to use it. I just write, from the piano, but like, it's probably beneficial to write in my notes where all those repetitive things are going to be, even though I'm not doing it like notating it, I'm just putting down chords.
Sure.
Because if I take it to like get produced, that's sort of like leaving it up to chance. They won't really hear all the riffs and things in their head. So
yeah, definitely. Like if you're taking it to another producer or something, you definitely would want to show them what you're hearing so they can help you create that for sure. Perfect. So contrast now is sort of the next step as you start to build your thought process. And contrast is sort of the relief from repetition, right? So you don't want something to be overly repetitive because that becomes monotone or rote, right? So you want to balance similarity and change. So contrast is exactly that. It's this versus that. So it's something versus something else. So contrast is a state of being different from something else, which examples are this versus that, dark versus light, it's long versus short, it's tension and then release, it's long notes and then short notes, it's a lot of different things that go into it, because like we said, with the rule of 2, you don't want to necessarily overly repeat things, but you do want to use repetition enough to where it gets the idea or that emotion across. So contrast is something that can really save you from boring your listener. And one of the things that I hear in a lot of newer songwriters is their verses and their choruses sound very similar. So by the time you're done listening to a 3-minute song, it feels longer than a 3-minute song because it got boring because you're hearing the same thing over and over again. So you want to make sure that you are using contrast to balance what you're repeating. So contrast usually happens between sections in order to keep your listeners interested in your song. This means verses should contrast to choruses, and bridges usually contrast to both your verses and choruses. And contrast can be built lyrically, melodically, harmonically, and just like groove and musically as well. So it's making sure that you're changing something so your listener keeps something fresh in their mind, but then a lot of times you're coming back to the original thing that was established because they like that coming home feeling as well. And we'll talk about the tools of doing all this as well. So we're just getting the basis now, and then we'll talk about how does this all play into how you write your songs. So how to create your next section. So a lot of times I also hear people say, like, I wrote a really good verse or I wrote a really great chorus, but now I don't know what to do with it. So contrast is where you can help craft what your next section does. So let's say you did develop a chorus and you're like, well, I don't know what I should do in my verses. Well, if you create a song section like that, the way to make decisions is to look at what you already have. So look at what are your lyrics doing? Are they short phrases? Are they long phrases? Is it a lot of words? Is it not a lot of words? Look at what you have and then make the other section be not that. So if you have short phrases in your chorus, then in your verse, maybe you should have long phrases to make it contrast to each other. So contrast is not only a tool for your listener, but it's also a tool for you as a writer, because once you know what you have, you can do something different or opposite of that. And I think that is it's been a super powerful tool for me, because I sometimes have to stop and do an inventory of like what's happening in this section and how do I make the other section different from it, so I'm not just keep on doing the same thing, because that's one of the things that makes you get super bored with the song, is if too many things are not changing. So let's talk about prosody then. So prosody is kind of like the film score of your song. And it's really the marriage between what your song is saying and how it's saying it. So prosody is the unity that's created between the structure and the content and how these two parts meet. And in songwriting, prosody is really what you are saying is matching how you're saying it. Andrea Stolpe, Berklee instructor and songwriting author, she calls prosody the body language of the song. So I'm sure you've heard in your just everyday life that sometimes it's not about what someone's saying. It's like, pay attention to their body language as they're saying it. Does that send a different message than, what their words are saying? That's where prosody within songwriting comes into play, is the structure could be saying something different than what your content is actually saying. And sometimes that's okay, but a lot of times if there's that disconnect, your listener will be confused. And the second your listener has to think about your song, they're not feeling it. And one of the things that can kill your listener's investment is if you make them do too much thinking about your song. People don't want to think while they're listening. They want to feel the music. So Pat Pattison uses the example of unstable topics and then unstable structure. And you can use structure to communicate emotions and create the prosody, within the content that you're trying to get across. Keeping on Pat Pattison and some of his theories, and for those of you who are not familiar with Pat is a songwriting instructor at Berklee College of Music, and he's kind of written like these resource books that have become sort of the accepted songwriting world's resource book. So Pat will say that there's a spectrum of stable to unstable, and making structural decisions, whether your structure is stable or unstable, is based on if your topic is stable or unstable. So again, we're going to give you a list of tools to do that, to accomplish this in a little bit as well. Dory, you have your hand up?
Well, before we go any further, Chad, could
Sure.
you, I don't understand the stable versus unstable. I don't understand that. Could you define that a little more clearly?
Yep. So think of it this way. So let's say you had a song that was about someone being very nervous about something. Would you say that that topic is stable or unstable?
Unstable.
So that's unstable. So then when you think about writing that topic, you would use unstable structure. So that means you may use an odd number of lines, you may not rhyme, you might shorten lines unexpectedly, like you might set up something that implies like the not being stable, right? And we'll go through like the actual tools that you have, but that's the idea, is thinking about it from what am I trying to say and how can I make the structure match that?
Okay, so let's take the example of rhythm. So could rhythm be one of the elements that you could make unstable to create the prosody between the lyric and the rhythm to create that instability? Would that be? Am I thinking?
Absolutely, for sure.
Okay.
So
Okay.
So great example. So if you're thinking, like you have an unstable rhythm, that means you're probably not starting on the downbeat. You're either starting before or after the downbeat.
Or
You're
maybe even
probably
syncopated. Maybe even syncopated.
correct. And that was what I was going to say is you probably want to syncopate it. And also it may be some irregular rhythm where it's like fast and then slow and then fast and then slow,
Okay.
and then if it's unstable too, you may not want repetition because repetition creates a sense of stability, right? So that's where all of this starts to sort of play into this fluid thing where these are tools, you know what I mean? So it's like
Yes,
there's
yes.
not one way to it your what you're trying to say dictates on how you say it. And I think the magic in using these tools is you as the writer can make that decision and your listener doesn't consciously know what's happening, but it sells it to them.
Okay. Do you know the song If the World Was Ending Tonight by Julia Michaels?
I've heard it a couple times, yeah.
And I was wondering if that kind of has an unstable theme, just the title, If the World Was Ending Tonight. They use a lot of like weird little things in there. Like they use speaking instead of singing. And I'm just thinking, that may be an example of unstable because
It
they
could
don't,
be,
they're not using conventional. It's not conventional in a traditional sense, if you know what I mean.
for sure.
Okay.
And maybe in a little bit we can pull that song up and listen to it. I haven't heard it well enough to be able to speak to it,
Okay.
but but yeah, that's the other thing too is once you know these things, listening to songs that you know and that you like and that you feel are effective, it can give you something to like look for like, oh, that's why I feel something because that's where the concept of the film score comes in. We've all seen movies where what's on the screen looks peaceful, but then there's like the dark music underneath of it, and you're like, oh, something's gonna happen. That's what your structure does underneath your song.
Okay.
So that's a good way to think about it.
Much
But no,
clearer. Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question. Great question. So again, if you want to dive into reading about some of these things, Pat Pattison, he wrote the book Writing Better Lyrics. Definitely check that book out. He also wrote the Songwriting Essentials, the Essential Guide to Lyric Form and Structure. So another great book to get. And those are books that Berklee College of Music uses to teach their courses. And they can get kind of heady, so you kind of have to like take them chapter by chapter and kind of slowly read them and kind of do some of the exercises, but they definitely help to give you a sense of how to work on lyrics especially. So now let's jump into the actual tools that you can think about as you write for repetition, for contrast, and for the prosody as well. So lyrical tools, you have a few things that you can play with within the lyrical tools. So the first one is how many lines there are. So if you had a stable topic, would you have even numbers of lines or would you have odd numbers of lines? And anybody can put that in the chat or speak up too. So the answer there is if you have an even number of things, that creates stability. If you want something that's unstable, you would have an odd number of lines. And have you ever heard a song that like the topic sounds like it should be sad, the music kind of sounds sad, but there's something that just it doesn't sound sad, right? And part of the reason is a lot of times that songwriter used an even number of lines. So it sounds too stable for the topic. And our brains, that's a disconnect where our brain's trying to figure that out. So that takes us out of experiencing that song. So if you're writing a song that's really sad or really unstable, try adding a line or taking away a line to try to unbalance it and see how that feels. And sometimes it might be taking a line away. So if you have a 4-line section, maybe it works better with 3 lines or sometimes it's adding to where you have like 5 lines. It really depends on how it feels to you as the writer. The other thing, or the other tool rather, for lyrical contrast prosody is how long are the lines? So how many stressed syllables are there? And the reason why we say stressed syllables is because the just counting syllables a lot of times doesn't help you understand how long the line actually sings, because stressed syllables are what usually line up with the strong beats within a musical measure. And you want to make sure that your words in your section that are important line up on those strong beats, which is the stressed syllables. So again, if you have a stable section, maybe all of your lines are the same length. But if you have an unstable section, maybe your lines vary. So if you look at the song Easy on Me by Adele, she, in her verse goes short, short, long, short, short, long. And then when you get to her chorus, it goes long, short, short, long, short, short. So it flips it, which is the contrast, right? So writers think about these things, about how your listener is experiencing it. And I think that's what separates amateur writers from some of the pros, is they are really thinking about like how the song is working at this level. And some people call it formulaic, but I don't think it's a formula. I think it's just getting into the physics of how people hear songs, honestly. The other part of it is your meter and your rhythm of the line. So what is the stress pattern? Like, is it dum da dum da dum da dum, dum da dum da dum, or is it dum da da dum da da dum da da dum? Like, you can contrast the meter within your lyric as well. Another thing that you can use, or another tool, is the rhyme scheme. So some rhyme schemes are much more stable than other rhyme schemes. So your most stable rhyme scheme is where all the lines rhyme, right? So the least stable is where none of the lines rhyme, but there's a huge spectrum within that as well. Yeah, so a lot of times within, like, one of the reasons why there's 4 lines in a lot of verses is usually one line of lyric equates to about 2 measures within the music, because there's really only so many beats that happen within each measure, and the beats correlate to the syllables, right? So a lot of times
Yeah.
if you have 4 lines, that equates to an 8-bar section. Or if you have 6 lines, a lot of times you'll have one line that is 1 measure, second line is 1 measure, and then your last line is 2 measures. So it's like short, short, long, or long, short, short. So it still, the math still works out, but it's a little bit different between 4 and 6 lines.
So 1 measure means 4 syllable.
What was that?
1 measure means 4 syllables or 8 syllables.
It could, but you could also have very fast syllables as well. So there could be more syllables falling in there as well. Richard, you had a question as well?
Well, I just wanted a quick comment on the meter thing too, and the idea of like, it could be 4 or 8 syllables, as in like 1, 2, 3, 4. But in that same time, if you put it into a triple meter, 1, 2, 3, 4 becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Like, you can, by using that 3 feel, you could easily have 12 syllables sitting in an 8, in the same space that 8 syllables might sit. So syllables, to the point that, why we talk about stresses rather than syllables, because the number of the syllables changes depending on the rhythmic meter of the lyric. And this is, in this context, we're talking strictly about the lyric, not the music per se. So that becomes kind of important to remember, that how the lyric is going to sit over the music, they're not always going to align the same way. And that that's one of the, again, contrast tools that I personally use a lot, just because I'm more lyric heavy with what I'm skillful with. Is it's commonly that, the first line of a verse will be very like that Mary Had a Little Lamb, very dum da dum da dum da dum, but then there'll be like a da 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 type of thing that happens to follow it up. So playing with the meter, the syllable count is like radically different, but the stress pattern ultimately is basically the same. So
Right. And in this context, we're talking about how changing it creates contrast or prosody, right? So it's not about how many words or how many syllables we're getting into one measure, because I think we naturally do that, right? Because if you're playing to a beat, you're going to know how that fits, but where your decision comes in is, okay, well, I had 12 syllables in my verse lines, maybe I should do less in my chorus, right? So it gives it that tension and release and sort of that contrast, if that makes sense. But Richard, that's a great point for sure. So the next thing we started talking about is rhyme scheme. So rhyme schemes can be really about stability and instability as well. So a stable rhyme scheme would be where everything rhymes within your section. Unstable would be where nothing rhymes, and then you have various degrees of it within, each section as well. And you kind of have to experiment, like, what works best for what you're trying to say. If you have an A-B rhyme scheme where the first line rhymes with your third line and the second rhyme lines with the fourth line, that's pretty stable because we feel resolution at the end. And that's the Mary Had a Little Lamb common rhyme scheme where it's, which is an XA. So it's Mary had a little lamb, fleece was white as snow. Everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. That feels done. But if you wanted to have a rhyme scheme that was unstable, you would flip it to maybe be like ABBA, because then it throws your listener off a little bit. Or maybe you do XAXX, where they're expecting a rhyme, but you're not giving it to them. So that would be like, so it'd be like Mary had a little lamb, fleece was white as snow. Everywhere that Mary went, the lamb went with her. That feels unstable. So as you think about your topic, if you have an unstable topic and you do the Mary had a little lamb and you give us exactly what we're expecting, subconsciously that feels wrong to us, even though we don't know that it feels wrong, if that makes sense. So think about your rhyme scheme, and it's kind of similar to thinking about how many lines you have, like, is it even or odd? Are you giving resolution within your rhyme scheme, or are you not giving resolution? And that can be a way to think about the contrast and prosody there. And then if you have every line rhyming in your verse, then do something different in your chorus, right? So like if you have AABB as your verse, which would be couplets, maybe you go to like a 6-line rhyme scheme and change the number of lines to your chorus. So it might be XXA. So you establish the couplets in the verse, but then when you get to your chorus, you have those 2 non-rhyming lines that it gives your listener something fresh to hear because they're not hearing that the same thing repeated over and over again. And I see a lot of new songwriters have every section has A, B, 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 and it all starts to sound the same because the more lyrical contrast you have, the lyric ties to the melody. So you almost instantly have melodic contrast within that as well. And then the other thing that you can change and what you can look at for contrast and prosody is your rhyme type. So there are different types of rhyme which they start at the most stable, which is perfect rhyme, which means your vowel sound and the consonant following it are exactly the same. So this is your played, stayed rhyme, right? Or like meter and Peter are a perfect rhyme, or heart and start. You know, those are perfect. So that's very stable. And think of like a perfect rhyme as like a major chord. And like that's your root. Like your perfect rhyme sounds resolved. It can stand out more than what you say, actually. Because a lot of times, I don't know if you've heard songs that amateur writers have written, a lot of times they try to hit perfect rhyme and all you hear are the rhymes on the end of the lines and it sounds written. And one of the goals as writers is we don't want to sound written. We want it to sound like somebody is experiencing our song. So perfect rhyme is the first type of rhyme. The next type of rhyme is family rhyme, where you have different families of sound. So you have the like the vocal family of like D, like D, P, T, K, like those are voiced sounds. You have fricatives like the like TH, like th, like CH, Z, like Z, like the unge sound, like lounge, that sound. That's another family. And then you have your nasals, which are like the NG sounds, like your M's and your N's and your ing sounds. So to think about a family rhyme, it would be like a rhyme of bad and cap. So bad and cap are within that same family because they're the vocalized sounds that come out of the front of our mouth. The vowel's the same, but the consonant on the end is different. So that's one notch less stable than your perfect rhyme. So family rhyme is the next type. Next, after family, is additive and subtractive. So additive is where you're adding a sound. So that would be like stay and played, because we're adding the D sound on that second word. So stay and played, add something new. Flip it and go played and stay, then that's your subtractive. So that's something that you can do too. So that's the next type of rhyme. After additive and subtractive, then you have what we would call assonance rhyme, which is similar to family rhyme, but the things that you're rhyming are not in the same family. So that would be like beat and teeth, because the vowel is the same, but the consonant on the end is not from the same family. So it could be also like street and seam, right? So it's the E sound, but you have the T on one and then the M on the other. So one is from the vocalized family, the other is from the nasal family. So that's the next is assonance rhyme. And then the least stable rhyme is consonant rhyme, where your vowel is different, but the consonant on the end is the same. So that would be like let me think of one. So it'd be friend and wind. So friend and wind would be a consonant rhyme, because the consonants on the end are the same, but your vowel is different. So it goes from perfect to family, additive, subtractive, assonance rhyme, and then consonant rhyme. And then, of course, the most unstable is you're not rhyming at all. Any questions on rhymes? So, a lot of people will rhyme heart with start. Like there's a ton of rhymes for heart if you actually start thinking about those different types of rhymes. Irish.
Yeah, what is the subtractive and what is the other subtractive and additive rhyme?
So that's where you're adding a sound or taking away a sound on the end. So an example of an additive rhyme would be like town and lounge, because you're adding the j sound on lounge, right? So it's town and lounge.
I see.
The vowel's the same, but you're adding a sound on the end. And then subtractive is where you're doing the opposite. So it would be lounge and town.
Oh,
And it's
so it becomes the same thing, it means.
it's kind of the same. You're just flipping the order, right? So you're either adding a sound or taking away a sound.
Oh, I see.
And those, like lounge and town, sounds different than gown and town, right? Gown and town are perfect because the vowel and the consonant are the same. That sounds really like stable. But if I said town and lounge, there's a little bit of instability that's added because it doesn't sound exactly the same. And that's a powerful tool when you're writing songs and it also opens up so many more possibilities for you as you think about writing songs, because you can find a ton more words that rhyme instead of just a few that are perfect. And perfect rhyme was used a lot more in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s within songs. And then when the 60s came along, they started using imperfect rhyme, and that's kind of carried on through music to today. So a lot of times, if you're using all perfect rhymes, it sounds a little bit unnatural to the modern listener. So trying to use other types of lines is definitely, or different rhymes, I should say, is helpful when you're writing songs. All right, so let's move on to the melodic tools for contrast and prosody. So again, these are things that, think of them as knobs that you can play with to try to get your song to match what you're saying. So the melody tools for contrast and prosody are number of phrases, so your number of melodic phrases, similar to number of lyric lines. Also, your melodic shape. So what we mean by melodic shape is, what are the notes doing? Are they ascending? Are they going up? Or are they descending and going down? Are they arcing up and then coming back down? Are they arcing down and then coming back up? Or are they staying flat? Or are they doing a zigzag? So when you get stuck on what to do from a melody perspective, is you can sort of think about this in advance. Like, let's say your verse melody stays on almost stable, so it's not doing a whole lot of moving. Then when you get to your chorus, you could have it do some arches and going down and doing some like zigzag, so it changes up what's happening from a contrast perspective. And think about it from a prosody perspective. If you had a topic that was very unstable, you may want to use zigzagging melodies because that's more of an unstable melody as well. Another thing to think about is how long your phrases are. So how long are the motifs, or how long are the melodic phrases? Also the melodic rhythms, like what are the note lengths doing? So are they short staccato notes, or are they long legato notes? Like Dory had said, are they on beat? Are they, having that syncopation, which aligns to like, where does the melody start? Is it starting on the downbeat, which is the one of the measure, or is it starting before? Is it starting after? If you had a song about someone being late, where would you start your melody, right? So that's the way to think about it. If you had a song about someone being late, you would start it after the downbeat and maybe further into the measure. If you had something where somebody was really anxious and wanted to get something done, you may start that line before the downbeat. And one of the tricks that you can use to keep your songs interesting is to change it between sections. So like the song How Will I Know that Whitney Houston sang, it starts before the downbeat because there's a pickup where it goes, there's a boy I know, he's the one I dream of. And then there's another pickup. looks into my eyes and takes me to the clouds above. And then when it gets to the pre-chorus, it goes on the downbeat where it goes, ooh, how will I know? Don't trust your feelings. How will I know? Oh, oh, oh. How will I know? And then by the time it gets to your chorus, they're starting after the downbeat where it goes dun 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 dun. How will I know if he really loves me? I say a prayer with every heartbeat. So that's a contrasting tool that is such a powerful way to change things up and make your melody sound interesting just through that change. The other thing to think about is the pitch range, right? So melodies are pitch and rhythm. So a lot of times your verses will be sort of the floor of your song, where that's kind of the lowest notes. Your pre-chorus is usually a little bit above that, and then your chorus is usually a little bit above that. So having that pitch contrast makes a difference as well. So let's say you had a song where you were talking about someone being depressed. You might have a melodic shape that goes down, because when people are depressed, they kind of talk down and they kind of go da, 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 da. And maybe that's what your pitch range is doing as well. So again, that's where the prosody comes in. And then you want to do something different when you change sections to keep it interesting for your listener. Perfect. So let's talk about harmony then. So within songwriting, harmony is another word for kind of your chords and what the chord progression is doing. So you have your chord types that you can change. So that would be major, minor, augmented, diminished, or you could extend chords, if you have like a minor 7, or you have a 7 chord, a 9, those types of things. So that is one way that you can think about prosody. So if you were writing a very happy song, more than likely you may choose more major sounding chords. Or if you're just kind of happy, but there's still a little bit of like just questioning, maybe that's like a minor 7 chord that still kind of has a major sound to it, but yet it's a minor chord. But like if it's really down in the dumps and you're like really unstable, that's where you get into like augmented and like diminished chords that you don't see a whole lot, honestly, in a lot of songs. But used correctly, you could put that chord under the right words and really send a really powerful message. The other thing is, what mode are you using, or what scale are you in? Are you using a major scale? Are you using minor? Are you Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian? Those modes, we're not going to necessarily get into modes here, but modes are definitely a tool to think about as well. And the easiest way to think about it is, am I in a major key or a minor key, or am I playing in the blues scale? Or am I doing like a Mixolydian, which is more of kind of a rock sounding scale, those types of things. The other thing that you can change is your order of the chords. So you can actually change the progression and how they're being played. So you can change the order. You can change how often the chords change. One cool trick to do is, like, in your verse, you could have your chords change every 2 measures. So like each chord goes for 2 measures. And then in your chorus, you could have them change on the measure, but have the same chords in the same order. And it creates a different momentum or harmonic momentum within the song. So it gives the impression of sort of speeding up or getting more energy. And you can play with the opposite way as well, depending on what your song is saying. You also can change the chord groove, which is really sort of the genre or how the chords are being played. So if you're playing a guitar, are you picking the notes and kind of doing an arpeggiated thing, or are you strumming the chords? Same thing on a piano, how are you playing those chords? And then of course the number of chords, can be changed as well. And that comes back to some of the repetition tools where you can do it the same, you can do it different, you can make it longer, you can make it shorter, you could use part of it or use a segment as well. So again, more tools to think about as you are looking at your harmony as well. From a groove perspective, when you think about contrast, prosody, and repetition, there's a few things that you can change. tempo, playing style, like we mentioned, also genre. You could also change instrumentation, especially if you're doing a more complicated arrangement. Like if you have instruments in your DAW, are you changing your instrumentation between your sections? A lot of times instruments are added as a song goes on to give that extra energy to the song. From you start with kind of more simple instrumentation, and by the end it's kind of like more anthemic kind of thing happening where it's the energy growing for your listener. So tempo, playing style, and genre really are ways that you can look at the groove tools as well. As we covered a ton of stuff quickly tonight, but how do you feel you may use some of these tools, and like, do you have any questions or comments on how you may use these, or kind of what are your thoughts out there at this point?
Yeah, I really want to start researching more about the whole syllable thing, because I really have I really like having a rhythmic. I use the subdivisions inside the rhythm a lot, and it attracted me, the syllable use, and I'm not familiar with all of that. I just count up my syllables, and because I just started doing that like a year ago, I'm new to it. So, but that really interests me because I can feel like the rhythm in words, and it just, to me, creates such an interesting lyric to have rhythm in your words. And so, and I like how when you had said, like when you have the stressed syllable on certain syllables, you can flip it, and that creates contrast within itself. And that's kind of like brilliant to me, because I'm always trying to figure out what kind of contrast to put in another section. And that would be something no one would really notice, but it would be there and you would feel it like in the beat.
Yeah, and one of the things to watch out for is that you're not accenting words that aren't important, right? Like you don't want like the to be like accented, right? Like, or Mary had a little lamb, like you accent the wrong, like it's not natural speech, right? Like Mary had a little lamb, so it's dum da dum da dum da dum. But if you went Mary had a little lamb, like that sounds wrong. So a lot of times you have to watch what syllable you're singing on those strong beats. Your strongest beat is always your downbeat, no matter what time signature you're in. If it's 4/4, if it's 6/8, the 1 is the most powerful beat, followed by the 3, 2, and then the 4. So like the strongest, and that works within any level of that measure too. So in 4/4 you have 1, 2, 3, 4, but it works on the eighth notes too. So you're like 1, 3, and be 1, 3, 5, 7 are the stronger beats within like the eight the eighth notes, if that makes sense. So the math works even when you're not talking quarter notes, if that makes sense. In the chat, Stevie says he's got a lot to learn. Just finished the first draft of a first song. Congratulations. And now he's questioning a lot of the decisions that you made. That's progress. If you look at what you've written and you're like, oh, now I need to think about what I did. That's great. That's awesome. Any other thoughts or questions on this? I know this stuff gets to be a little bit heady, and it takes a while to sort of have it sink in, but listen to the songs that you love and look at, where are you hearing the contrast and where are you seeing some of these tools as well? Catrice.
I really appreciate, I'm learning along the way, and I appreciate hearing that there's a difference between unstable and stable lyrics and format. And I do that, I've been doing that intuitively as I've been learning, but now I know that that can be done mindfully to achieve a particular goal, to achieve a certain emotionality or less so. That is very great to hear, and I plan to use that actively, that's a good place for me to put my foot and start stepping. Thank you for that.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. If this is your first at-home songwriting workshop, I welcome you and hopefully you'll come back to more. Definitely appreciate all of you. And if you know other songwriters that could benefit from this, tell them about it as well, because it's good to connect. But thank you all very much for joining me tonight. I appreciate it.